If you want your mixes to have that loud polish, you need to understand how to use a limiter. And it characterizes tons of genres from dubstep, house, D&B, techno, and way more. So today we're going to be diving into the world of limiters, from the very basic controls which help you sculpt and shape your masters and mixes, and the specific use cases in which you can be using them. Now, a key in understanding how a limiter works is that you need to first understand how a compressor works, because they are two very similar devices. And the best way to understand exactly how a compressor works is to grab our free compression cheat sheet down below in the description. It covers every control from ratio, threshold, attack, and release, and beyond. And then we can dive into the world of limiters. So first, we need to understand what is a limiter. Now, the way I like to think of a limiter is, imagine you're growing a plant inside of a little terrarium, and over time that plant will grow. But once it reaches the top of the terrarium, it no longer can get any taller. It will tend to just fill out the rest of the glass jar. That's kind of how a limiter works. The audio will be capped off at a certain loudness point. Anything pushed into it even more will just fill up the existing space below. You can see it with this example pre-master track I've got on here. Now, I'll be using Pro L2 to demonstrate this, which is one of my favorite limiters. But let's see what happens if I just put it up onto full screen. I'll play the song, turn it on. Increase the volume. So you can see here that the audio is never going above that red line at the top there, right? It's getting pushed back down into the audio spectrum, right? This is essentially what a limiter is doing, is it's controlling the maximum volume a signal is going to reach.
Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, why would I want to do this? There's not much point in boosting up the volume if it's not going to get louder than a certain point, right? Well, this is where something called perceived loudness comes into play. We're not just making a sound more squashed, it actually brings up the overall floor of the signal, making it sound louder to us as humans, even though the peak volume remains capped off at that maximum point. And this is what helps us get a unified, clean, and full mix.
Now, the reason a limiter is related to a compressor is because it's basically a compressor with a very strict threshold. It lets nothing above the threshold, whereas a compressor tends to turn it down a little bit over the threshold. So that's the difference. A limiter is strict, a compressor is more relaxed. In terms of ratio, limiters tend to have a ratio of about infinity to 1 for brick wall limiters, but anything from 10 to 1 upwards for less intense limiting effects. Now, limiters are used particularly in mastering as the final form of processing to ensure that maximum boost of volume is there and to ensure nothing is going over 0 decibels so that we're not going to get any sort of clipping. Now, if you're familiar with soft clipping, that is a sort of similar effect that I've actually covered in a video where I've compared limiters and clippers, so I'll leave a link for that up in the corner. But for now, we're going to be going into the specific controls of a limiter. Now, every limiter has its own specific set of controls, and you really need to pick which one works for you. I'm going to be comparing and contrasting my two favorite limiters, which have slightly different approaches: FabFilter Pro L2 and the Ozone 10 Maximizer. These are very common in electronic music and beyond, and they have slightly different workflows that I want you to know. Now, FabFilter Pro L2 functions based on what I like to refer to as a gain-based workflow, and Ozone 10 functions with what I like to call a threshold-based workflow. Now, in a gain-based workflow, threshold is set to 0 dB, and all you're doing is boosting up the input gain to increase the volume going into that threshold, ensuring nothing goes over 0 dB. I like the gain-based workflow because it's the most intuitive and it makes the most sense to me in my brain. However, the threshold-based workflow functions slightly differently. It gets to the same end result, but instead of boosting up the input gain, you actually bring down the threshold. So now the signal is going to be limited to 10 dB, but what the threshold-based workflow does is it basically limits it at that and then adds 10 dB of automatic makeup gain, bringing it to 0 dB anyway. So both achieve the same result with a slightly different internal mechanism. I'm going to continue to explain things with Pro L2 just because that's my personal favorite, but these apply with Ozone 10. So the other controls tend to be ceiling, attack and release, look ahead, and the particular limiting algorithm. And then beyond that, other limiters have different controls such as stereo linking, transient emphasis, and some even have clippers built in. The ceiling in Pro L2 is this little output level control here. This adds a bit of a gain reduction right at the end of the limiter signal just to ensure that nothing, for example, when there's going to be MP3 conversion, which can potentially introduce little spikes in the audio, will go over 0 dB. Producers tend to bring this down to -0.2 to -0.3, and that tends to be enough to avoid any issues there. But apart from that, you can leave it around 0 dB. You don't want to be bringing this down too much unless you have a specific reason to be doing so. Limiting style. Now, like I mentioned, every limiter is different with this. FabFilter Pro L2 has a bunch of styles here, and each one has a different purpose. Now, when it comes to Pro L2, I like to use the modern and transparent modes with the occasional use of the aggressive mode for mastering. And then I tend to use some of these other ones for more mixing and peak control. Basically, what you want to do is go through the limiter of your choice and just boost up the gain and listen to how each of the different styles affect the audio. If you exaggerate it, you can really start to hear exactly what's going on. So modern seems to pump before it distorts, whereas transparent, for example, seems to distort before it pumps. And obviously this is all exaggerated and we wouldn't use this. So then you can test them out, bring the gain down and see which style suits what you're going for in that particular application. The other major control here is the look ahead. Now, keeping the look ahead as low as possible before you get distortion is kind of the ideal workflow here. Long look ahead times will tend to be safer and not as distorted. So it's kind of a trade-off between that pumping and that distortion effect. So you kind of want to get to the minimum look ahead, particularly for a mastering application, before the distortion starts to become obvious, and then kind of play around with the gain and look ahead to find a nice balance for what you're going for. Attack and release function very similar to how they function on a compressor, with the exception that attack actually, instead of it being how long the compressor, or in this case a limiter, will kick in, it's actually an effect of how long the release will take to kick in, which is a different thought process, right? Because a limiter should act instantly as soon as the audio hits 0 dB. We don't want to let anything through, which it does depending on the style. And playing around with these two knobs here, regardless of the exact limiter you're using, will get you very different results. And because these are so very dependent on the style, you really need to hear how this is affecting the audio depending on the limiter algorithm you're using. For example, short attacks and releases on a certain style of limiting will sound very reactive and kind of unnatural to the audio, whereas longer attacks and releases will compress the audio too much and you're not really getting the full spectrum of loudness that you possibly could get. So you need to find a natural sweet spot. I like to personally think of the attack control as a hold rather than attack, because it's kind of like holding things and then the release will kick in. So the default in Pro L2 I personally really like, and they have the release set to about 400, the attack about 250-ish. And that's kind of fast enough that it can react to the audio well, but not so long that it's just delaying and keeping the audio limited and down longer than it really needs to be. And it's a nice sweet spot, like so. And you're getting some weird artifacts on the modern algorithm there. So it's nice to give it a bit of room to breathe. So now we're going to go to other controls. Some other really cool controls I particularly like on Pro L2 are the delta function. So I can play some audio here. And I can go to this headphones icon here, and it's called audition limiting in Pro 2. It's called Delta in other plugins, and it basically allows me to hear the effect of the limiter. So what is being limited in the original audio signal. And as I bring the gain down here, we can hear it's just the kick and the snare that really start to trigger it. And this is a great way to hear if distortion is coming onto your signal. It's likely that parts of the signal are being pushed too loud into the limiter, for example, the vocal or the more melodic elements of a song, and causing the distortion. Whereas kicks and snares, you can kind of get away with a lot more limiting because of the transient nature of the sounds. Another cool one is unity gain, which basically compensates with output gain, turning it down by the amount of input gain there is. So this is great to make sure that we're not actually getting any extra loudness. We're actually just hearing the limiter effect. So if I go back down to 0 dB, I'm going to turn this to transparent just for this particular application and play the audio. So the average volume isn't actually getting any different here. We're just able to hear the increasing of the limiting, which is really cool to train your ears so that you're not just hearing loudness increase, which is very easy to hear, but you're actually hearing what is the limiter doing in the overall context. Another cool effect, which is again different on different plugins, is stereo linking or stereo unlinking. In the case of Ozone 10, it's called stereo independence. And in the case of Pro L2, they're actually the opposite. So the higher the value, the more they are linked rather than unlinked. When the values are at 0%, what you're going to get is the limiter treating the left and the right channel fully independently. It's almost like you've got one limiter acting on the left and one limiter acting on the right with the same setting. This is going to create a more stereo-wide effect because it's treating the left and right differently. This is the same in the case of the transient response, which is how punchy the limiter is acting, and the release response, which is how it reacts to the end tail of the limiter effect, like we covered here. But if we have it fully linked at 100%, it's going to sum the signal that the channel linking is listening to one monoized signal. And this is great for a more powerful, central, and consistent effect. Now, which should you use? It really depends on the context of the song and the mix. I personally like to use around 60%, which again is pretty standard to the default settings in FabFilter Pro L2. The reason it sounds so good is because it's mostly monoized, so it's that powerful central feeling with that little bit of sprinkle considering the stereo image. So it's kind of partially listening to the individual left and right channels, but mostly still listening to just the central channel. And this sounds really nice on most audio. The effect here is very subtle depending on whether you use linked or unlinked, and a wide mix will obviously have a more obvious effect. But in electronic dance music and most pop, rock, and normal kind of genres where you've got a strong central channel, the difference is very minor. But it's important to consider what your limiter is going to be doing. And then a lot of limiting plugins also have metering. So we can see LUFS values, we can see the gain reduction values, for example, on Pro L2 here. We can see the max gain reductions are at -6-ish on the left and right. And also that more blue bar, the other one's a bit more gray, is determining the RMS value or the average loudness. However, the metering I find in a lot of cases isn't sufficient in a lot of the mastering plugins, so I like to use a separate metering plugin, which I'll be getting to in a second. So really quickly, I just wanted to mention what true peak limiting is. Now, there's a button on the Pro L2 here to enable it, and also one at the top here on an Ozone Advanced. True peak limiting attempts to limit it considering how the audio is going to be converted to an analog signal when it comes out of your speakers. So it's going to add basically a tiny little layer of extra protection to ensure what's called an intersample peak, which is the line that's drawn between two digital bits, does not exceed or go over 0 dB because audio is not ones and zeros, it comes out as a continuous waveform. So true peak limiting circumvents that by adding that extra layer of protection in. However, what it can do is reduce some of the dynamic punchiness of your drums or parts of the audio that contain that kind of information. So it's kind of used in a lot of cases as the final mastering limiter. However, through your mix, you may want to not turn it on because you know you're going to use it in your mastering anyway. However, for electronic dance music, my good friend Nick from Panorama Mastering has recommended not using this even in mastering because it actually just gets rid of that punchiness that you want for a club-friendly mix. So if you're making that kind of music, see if it works for you. You can play around with it for yourself and see what happens. But we've been covering basically limiters in the case of mastering for the last little bit. So I want to dive into a few other applications. However, I will quickly mention that the main purpose of mastering is to, again, provide that final push of loudness and to get to your target LUFS value. Now, for a nice little indie kind of chill track like this, I would recommend around -11 to -9 LUFS at most. Now, the third-party metering plugin that I've chosen to use here in addition to my FabFilter Pro L2 is Ulean Loudness Meter 2. It's a free plugin. I'll leave a link for it in the description. And the reason I like it is because it dives into the specific measurements such as short-term and integrated LUFS, showing me how loud my track is, not just in the short term, but over the full song, the real-time dynamics and how loud and quiet the different sections are, and various other things. So it's really holistic and gives me a accurate picture of where the loudness of my song is at. So we could use our FabFilter Pro L2 here. I'm going to turn off Ozone 10, and we can just basically use our gain here to get to the maximum LUFS. Now, it's worth mentioning if you're getting to your maximum LUFS and it's sounding bad, it's either some settings on the limiter need to be tweaked to make it a bit more suited to the audio, or something in your mastering chain, or potentially even in your mix is causing problems that you need to go back and fix. Now we're getting to around -10 integrated there for the drop, which is kind of nice. So I'm pretty happy with that. And it's sounding good. There's no distortion. One thing I would recommend as well when you're mastering is never try and do more than 6 dB of gain reduction. And normally that would be recommended only on transient elements like drums and maybe plucky bass lines, because anything beyond that will likely start to introduce large amounts of distortion. Now, a second use case here is on a drums bus. Again, because drums are quite transient elements, you don't want the limiter to have to work too hard on just controlling the drums. You want to do that a bit in the mix first. So I've just got 3 drum loops here, and we can just listen to them without any sort of limiting on first. So each of those is doing a different thing, but the sum of all the elements are going to add some interesting dynamics to our overall signal, right? So limiting can be really cool just to control that overall effect. So I'm going to enable the limiter here, and I'm going to use the transparent mode on Pro L2 to achieve this effect. I think transparent works great on drums as that last thing in the signal chain on your drums bus. What I'm going to do is just try and unify the peaks here a bit. Let's bring up some gain and see what happens. So we can see here it's really just hitting the kick and snare mostly. None of the hats are being limited, which is kind of what I want. The kick and the snare tend to be the loudest elements, but I want to really just hear what's going on. So I'm going to bring on unity gain because I don't really want to be adding loudness itself. I just want to be controlling the peaks of the drums bus. So we can hear when it was too much. Now what I'm going to go ahead and do is just turn this limiter on and off to see if it's actually improving the control of the drums or if it's actually making it worse. So let's listen to it on. Now let's listen off. Yeah, so it just tightens things up for me. The kick and the snare just reined back in a bit, and doesn't feel as flabby and kind of random, and it doesn't really ruin the dynamics of the sound for me. So that was kind of a nice sweet spot. Now, another use case for limiters is in sound design. Now, sound design, you have crazy things going on sometimes. There's huge dynamic changes, distortion, modulation. And often what can happen by the end of the signal chain is you've got a mess of audio in terms of dynamics. So a limiter on the end can kind of just be a nice way to control that. Now let's listen to this sound that I've created here and see what we've got going on. Going to increase the rate here on the sound. There's quite a lot of processing going on here and it's just a bit chaotic. So what I'm going to do is turn on the limiter here. Now bear in mind, I'm turning this down 9 dB on the fader, just so it's not blasting your eardrums, but it's still being limited at 0 dB at the end of the signal chain pre-fader. And you can see here just those momentary transients are being limited. Now I'm using Ableton's limiter, which is a very basic kind of brick wall-ish limiter, I would say. It sounds quite pumpy if pushed too hard, but for sound design safety, it's a great tool. I tend to use it on the minimum lookahead still so we don't get too much of a pumping effect, and let the auto release control just kind of determine what it thinks is best for the audio. You can also control the ceiling here. I probably would just bring it up to 0 dB again because this is more of a sound design thing. We don't really need to worry about MP3 conversion or anything like that. And we can also push a bit of extra volume into the sound as well if we like, so let's do that. Just gives it a bit of extra chunkiness while controlling it at the same time. So that's really, really cool to put on at the end of a signal chain when doing post-processing in sound design. So the last kind of main use case I would use the limiter is for peak control on acoustic or dynamic instruments such as vocals. Now I've pulled a few vocals from a project that I'm working on a drum and bass track. This is my original voice, a few layers, and quite a bit of processing on already, including compression, multi-band compression, but we can actually just listen to these for a second and see what they sound like.
Come close, honey there, our truth, I'm seeking.
It sounds pretty good, but there's just a few peaks that I can hear just that jump out on certain words, and a limiter is a great final tool to kind of capture any of those and make the vocal, in my opinion, sound like it dynamically and sonically fits with synths and other less dynamic instruments, right? So I love using a bit of subtle limiting. Now I'm going to use Pro L2 here again. I'm going to use it on the all-round mode because I find this is a nice, transparent, yet not super duper surgical sounding limiter. And I'm just going to give it a bit of a push here, and we can leave all the other controls the same for now. Basically what I'm going to do is boost up the volume here and see what we get.
Come close, honey there, our truth, I'm seeking. Her face, don't matter. She's smarter than you, but you're better.
Right, so we're just doing 2 dB there, and you're just noticing those really loud syllables or vowels are just being a bit tamed. And this is just a great way to make sure we're going to get a consistent sound out of our vocal. Again, we're not going too hard here, knowing we've applied a lot of compression and other effects already. It's just that final push. The real thing you don't want to introduce here is distortion. So again, use a soft, subtle form of limiting. But I trust this has given you a really holistic, big picture understanding of limiting. A reminder, compression and limiting are really similar, and you do need to understand compression before you kind of can dive into the world of limiting, in my opinion. So make sure to grab our free compression cheat sheet down below in the description. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.